Hello, it's John Heaton. This evening I'm going to answer a request from a comment I had from Grimsby Reapers on one of my videos where I was discussing the solo Beatles, I think. And he posed a question, which it's a hypothetical question, but we'll discuss it anyway, shall we? What would have happened if the Beatles hadn't existed and the careers of Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starkey had started in 1970? So I thought about it and thought, well, should I respond? And I can't resist something like this. A couple of things. First of all, it's quite an assumption, obviously, to say the Beatles didn't exist at all. I suppose we could hypothetically wipe them from history and say that Paul started writing songs at the time of his first solo album with Every Night and Teddy Boy and Maybe I'm Amazed. But, one has to think, well, it's a little bit unfair to discuss that because you're taking away all of the songs that were written by the Fab Four up until the age of 28 to 30. That's the whole of their 20s for the most part. And most musicians produce their best work when they're young, I think it's fair to say. So to wipe that whole entire songwriting catalogue out of existence and just say how would have Paul, John, George and Ringo fared with the solo work and nothing else, we can discuss it, but maybe a more interesting discussion, or maybe another discussion we could have is how John, Paul, George and Ringo would have fared individually had they not got together with all the songs that they wrote for the Beatles and without the Beatles. That may be a fairer discussion, because I think John Lennon was quoted, and I was trying to find where this quote was from, but I think he said something to the effect of, I wasn't good looking enough, Paul was not quite talented enough to make it on his own. I think he said George didn't have the personality and Ringo is just Ringo, or something like that, meaning that none of us on their own would have been as strong as we were together. And I think obviously with history and with hindsight, one can obviously see that as a group that they had a bigger impact. And when they split, that impact was not so great. And people revere Beatles music not in the same way as they look upon the solo work, I think it's fair to say. And George Harrison at the time of Abbey Road, he was aware, I think even though he wanted the group to split, he was aware of the commercial advantages of staying in the Beatles, because he knew that whatever they put out, good or bad, I think he was saying, would be a hit in any case. But I think the Beatles didn't put out any bad product, but as a point, I suppose it was a fair one, because even if they had put out a record of them scratching their heads, it probably would have been a hit. But anyway, so the power of the group image was very powerful, and without that, by the time the Beatles split, all four of them were household names, so they already had a massive head start in terms of solo career. Would they have had that on their own? That's the question. So I think that maybe John would not have started his whole career with Plastic Ono Band, because that was a very personal statement, and I think Carr and Tyler were saying in their review, if that had been released by an unknown artist, it probably would have been ignored. But because it was John Lennon, ex-Beatle, people knew that the pain he'd been through, they knew of his childhood, etc., and it was that much more powerful. But then, having said that, I think John would have emerged as, in some respect or other, as a great humanitarian. A song like Imagine would have been the hit that it was, I think, regardless of whether the Beatles had existed or not. And who's to say? He could have, it's difficult to speculate here. With Paul, I think, again, he would have achieved success as a commercial singer-songwriter in the same way as, a lot of other solo artists like James Taylor and people have succeeded. You don't need a group to succeed, although in the 60s the groups were the more common form of musical expression. In the 70s it became the opposite, and the solo artist was more prevalent. Although one could make the case that the Beatles had paved the way for the singer-songwriters. I don't know, it's difficult, because David Bowie and Elton and those guys came out of the shadow of what the Beatles had achieved with the Stones and stuff in the 60s. So, you know, George, another interesting one, because his profile was pretty high by the time the Beatles split, because he was the one who took the Beatles to the Maharishi, and he introduced the Western world, to an extent anyway, to spiritualism and Eastern religion, Hare Krishna, and that's epitomised in the Yellow Submarine movie. And as I say, George was a household name, so when he came out with My Sweet Lord, everyone knew who he was, and it struck a chord. Whether it would have struck a chord if the Beatles hadn't existed, I don't know, but a little unfair on George. With tracks like Here Comes the Sun and While My Guitar, to say that if they hadn't ever existed, well, I suppose, okay, we're having the discussion, let's continue. So I think George would have made it again as a successful singer-songwriter. His songs are too good not to have been successful. After all, Paul Simon was for the most part on his own, although he was with Garfunkel. He wrote all the tracks and he dominated that partnership, and he's had great success on his own, and he's similar in talent, in my opinion, to someone like George. So I think he would have had success. Ringo is a bigger question. Maybe he was riding along on the coattails of the Beatles for his early solo career, and maybe the record company wouldn't have given him a deal. But then, as John Lennon said, Ringo's personality would have come out in one form or another. That thing which we can't put our finger on, that is Ringo, would probably have come out. You know, whether that would have been in a public capacity or as a personality in his hometown of Liverpool, I don't know, because being famous and successful isn't the only criteria for being judged a success. You know, you can be larger than life and soul of the party in your own circle of friends and your own family, and do very well without having one hit. So I think Ringo would have come out, maybe he would have been a good actor, or maybe he just would have been owned a couple of barbershops, who knows. But it's a very difficult question to answer, and but I'm a big fan of the solo work, and I think, you know, I spent years making hypothetical Beatles albums out of the 70s solo work in particular, when all four of them were producing. And I think, you know, if you take the creme of the solo albums, you've got songwriting which is on a par with what the Beatles did in the 60s. You know, maybe consistently they couldn't produce a whole album with brilliance time after time, but, you know, that was what the group gave them. They were all in one pot, all rivaling each other and pushing each other to greater boundaries. So without that quality control, we would have had a lot more output, but maybe, you know, wouldn't have been quite as consistent. But I think the world would still be singing quite a few tracks from John, Paul, George and Ringo, irrespective of whether the Beatles had existed. So it was a bit of a rambling video. I hope it answered the question, Grimsby Reapers, and it's a bit of an unknown, a bit hypothetical, but we like these discussions, so thank you for watching.